I want to thank the organizers for inviting this paper to the conference. We're really excited to receive the discussion from Mara and the questions from the group. This paper is co-authored with Lakshmi Naaraayanan and Varun Sharma, both at London Business School. And I just wanted to highlight Varun is a rising PhD student, so please look out for him. He's an excellent researcher. Scientists have warned us that climate change is the greatest challenge facing humanity in the foreseeable future. There is mounting evidence suggesting that climate change possesses a significant risk both for capital markets and for households. And with investors increasingly concerned about the long-term sustainability of their investments, institutional investors and particularly pension funds have resorted to putting pressure on companies to address their contribution to climate change risks. So against this backdrop, this study studies the real effects of environmental activist investing. And the way we think about environmental activism is investors engaging boards with the primary goal of improving corporate environmental behaviors rather than the financial performance or to increase their personal wealth. Now, it is unclear that environmental activism would necessarily bring about real changes. So on one hand, there's well-documented literature documenting the benefits that firms receive from becoming more sustainable. And you imagine they'd already be executing on these ideas and pursuing them already. On the other hand, if they are already comparing the marginal cost against the marginal benefits of adjusting to becoming more sustainable, they may realize that it is value destructive and be avoiding these activities, even if an investor comes and demands it. So in this paper, we focus on the impact that these campaigns on environmental behaviors have, who actually benefits from it, and what are the costs of such engagements to the firms. So in this paper, this is kind of a summary of what I hope to talk about in our presentation, and we break it up into 4 pieces. The first part of our presentation, we want to emphasize and hopefully convince you that we find that firms that are targeted by investors improve their pollution by reducing their total toxic releases, those coming from stack air emissions, and primarily greenhouse gases, those known to be contributing to climate change. Now, if these impacts were really important, we should also be able to detect this in the local areas around plants of targeted firms. So what we do is we characterize and study what are the effects on the local economies around these plants and find that pollution related to cancer causing tends to reduce in these areas. We also find an improvement in air quality within a 1-mile radius around targeted plants. And we also find a reduction in the intensity of pollution. And we'll talk about what I mean by intensity as we get there. In the third part, we study how firms are actually achieving this. And we see on one hand, they're improving their operations by focusing on high impactful activities to reduce their pollution. The second part is that we also look at the new abatement efforts that they're taking on, and you see new abatement initiatives that they're taking on. And we also are able to look at the plant level and measure the change in capital expenditures related to abatement activities. And in the final part, we study the financial performance and the financial implications of these activist campaigns, of this activist campaign, and we show that firms' operational efficiency and profitability also tends to decrease as well. Now, in our paper, we study a long-term shareholder and particularly focus on the Boardroom Accountability Project, which was initiated by the New York City pension system. So the New York City pension system initiated the Boardroom Accountability Project and was accompanied by the CalPERS and CalSTRS in targeting portfolio companies to improve their sustainability along several specific mandates. In our study, we focus on their climate change initiative and how this affected firms, how they were affecting the environment, these firms. And so I want to emphasize that these activist campaigns were very well organized, coordinated between these different pension funds. They were messaging directly with the board of directors, attending annual general meetings, and most importantly, presented a credible threat to board members. And so what we're interested in is understanding how do firms respond to this focused climate mandate brought forward by these large public pensions, and what are the externalities and real effects of this. So our empirical setup uses a difference in differences propensity score matching approach, which is common in the literature. And what we do is we're comparing between firms that were targeted by the Boardroom Accountability Project against similar firms, similar counterfactual firms. In our estimating equation, the key coefficient of interest is beta 2, and we include plant cross-chemical fixed effects and chemical cross-time fixed effects as well. Now, the way you'd want to interpret this is not that if the Boardroom Accountability Project was to randomly select firms, would they have improved their environmental behavior? But instead, we think of this as a treatment effect on the treated. If the Boardroom Accountability Project was to select these firms but remain passive in their approach, that's kind of the appropriate counterfactual you want to think about. And so we matched our targeted firms against the constituents of the Russell 3000. We match across their industry using Fama-French 12 industry classifications, and also control for firm size, return on asset, book to market ratio, and also their sustainability. And so if we have some time, I can show that we do several robustness around this and to give a little bit more confidence in our results. It's important also to point out that this matching was guided primarily by conversations with the New York City pension system. So we had several calls with them, submitted FOIA requests, and also conducted a target selection model to really back into what were the real selection reasons, or how they chose these firms, and was it based off of their pollutive levels or not? And it seemed at least this was not the case, ex ante. So in terms of our data, we spend a great deal of time trying to collect as much data to provide a more comprehensive picture of what were the real effects of these activist campaigns. So our primary outcome variables rely on data from the EPA. And the idea is that we focus on this just to first give us a complete picture of the real effects, but also to avoid biases that might be introduced by relying on any one data set themselves. So in the first part, I want to focus on what were the changes in corporate environmental behaviors. So here is our difference and differences plot. In the x-axis is our event time. We're normalizing at time 0. Our key dependent variable is 1 plus our total toxic releases, taking a log of that. Our treated firms are the blue dots, and our control firms are the red triangles. And there's 3 key points I want to emphasize here. The first one is looking at our pre-trends, or looking at the difference between our treated control in the pre-period. We don't seem to see a large difference between these two, or variation in these two in the pre-period, which is important. In our post-targeting, we look at our control group and we see that they're near 0 and steady across in our post-period. And third, and most importantly, we see this large and persistent decrease in total toxic releases from the plants of targeted firms. So it gives us our first, at least visual evidence that there are some real effects coming about at these plants. Estimating this relationship, we're focusing again on beta 2, and we're really careful in specifying our dependent variable. It's if holding all things constant, if economic activity increases, tautologically you'd expect the pollution to increase at the plant level. So to deal with this, we scale our pollution by lag cogs, or you think of inputs to production. And so if we have time in the robustness, I can show you we tried other scaling variables and other approaches, and it's not driven necessarily, not driven by this. And so our first main result is showing that the total toxic releases of plants tend to reduce by 13% relative to the sample mean. So these are large and important effects in terms of showing that these activist campaigns and engagements have real effects on the pollutive levels of these plants. Now, decomposing these results, we look at the reductions on on-site versus off-site pollution. We find that primarily our results are coming from reductions in on-site pollution. So that's the pollution that's produced at the actual plant versus the off-site plants. We don't find the pollution being sent to a separate facility for processing or so forth. When we consider the medium of exchange, a medium of release, and how do they actually reduce this pollution? Well, we look across stack air. You can think of these as confined spaces such as chimneys. Those relate to production. Fugitive air, think of leaks from pipes, or surface water discharge. And we find primarily our results are coming from reductions in stack air emissions. Those relate to the core operations of a business. Now, if the Boardroom Accountability Project was focusing on addressing risks related to climate change. So the question is, were firms actually responding by reducing gases that affected global warming? Well, we address this by using the greenhouse gas reporting data from the EPA and show that these reductions are also coming along, reductions are also seen in a reduction in methane and nitrous oxide, two of the most lethal greenhouse gases. So it seems like these activist campaigns have real and important effects on levels of pollution and those related to climate change. Now, if these reductions were, truly impactful at the plant level, we would also expect to be, we'd hope to be able to see them at least in the local areas around these plants. So we turn our attention in the second part of this presentation to measure what were the externalities of the local plants. The first part is we look at the change in pollution related to and use data from the EPA to understand what is the bodily impact of this pollution that is being reduced on humans. And we find that there is a key reduction in cancer-causing chemicals being polluted around these plants. And so we see a reduction in respiratory, developmental, nervous, hematological, and hepatic types of cancer pollution. So again, showing that these reductions don't just help to improve, perhaps reduce their impact on the environment, but also to the local economy as well. The second way that we want to approach this is thinking about the air quality around the plant. And so what we do is we use air quality monitor data within a 1 mile radius around these plants and measure, are there any measurable differences or reductions in the pollution? And so we find key reductions in ozone, sulfur dioxide, and also particulate matters as well. So these are robust to changing the distance from 1.125 or 0.75 within a mile radius around these plants, provide important evidence that these campaigns have important effects on these local economies. Now, how do we think about the affected population? Well, we want to think about this through the intensity of pollution. And broadly speaking, we use the risk screening environmental indicator model made available by the EPA. What it does is it interacts three key parts of pollution. So it looks at the toxicity of the chemical that's being released. You can think of carbon dioxide versus arsenic. Population, is it North Dakota or New York City? And dosage, is it 1 pound or 1 gigaton? And tries interacting these three to come up with a score about ranking how impactful was this pollution. What we see is that while we know the location of the activist investors, or at least the lead of the Boardroom Accountability Project is New York City, what we find here is that there's changes across the United States, and firms are reacting not just at plants close to New York City, but across the plants that they operate. Now, when we actually test this and see kind of how are firms reducing the intensity of pollution, well, we see that firms are focusing on not just reducing a headline number in total pollution, but focusing on those that are particularly affecting individuals by reducing. We see a reduction in their total score, in toxic concentrations, number of chemicals that are being released, and also the number of releases as well. So it seems like these activist campaigns also have large and important effects on these local economies as well. So the obvious question is, how are firms actually achieving these changes? So what we do is we first use a setup by the EPA to understand, are they approaching high impactful activities such as reducing and reusing waste by reducing the amount that they produce, or are they focusing on lower impactful strategies such as recycling, energy capture, and treatment? So we split our analysis and try understanding this, and it seems like overwhelmingly our results are being driven by high impactful activities such as reducing the total toxic releases rather than treatment. Now, when we think of how do firms actually achieve this reduction, we look at are they undertaking new abatement initiatives? And so using pollution prevention data also from the EPA, we look at plant level initiatives, and do we see an important change in new abatement initiatives to help achieve these changes? So we see that firms are taking on additional spill prevention initiatives to reduce spills and leak prevention, and also new good operating practices. So again, it's more suggestive evidence about the channel by which firms are able to actually achieve these results. Now, we're able to use data from the pollution prevention data, but we also focus on a narrow subset of data for utility firms. And we do this because through the EIA, we're also able to get capital expenditures on abatement initiatives and measure what are the costs, or do we see increased spending within these areas as well. And so while this is a much more narrow sample, we also see that total expenditures and those particularly related to abatement initiatives are increasing following the targeting of these firms. And so this provides the clearest evidence that firms are increasing their expenditures to actually respond to the targeting of these targeting by the Boardroom Accountability Project. Now, are these abatement efforts also accompanied by a change in levels of production? So one question that we thinking about is it also coming about by firms not just increasing the number of levels of abatement initiatives and spending on abatements, but also a reduction in production? So using plant level data, we look at either the rate of production or the level of production. And at least the evidence suggests that there is these improvements are not also accompanied by a change in the production at the plant level. So again, provides suggestive evidence that these are truly coming about by new initiatives that firms are taking to particularly address the concerns raised by the Boardroom Accountability Project through abatement initiatives. Now, in the final part of the presentation, I want to focus on the effect that these have on the performance of the firm. So at least in the short to medium term, we're able to assess what is the performance on these firms. And we find that the operational efficiency, you can think of the return on assets on these firms, are decreasing in the post period. So they're becoming less efficient. Also, when we consider the profitability of these firms, well, again, suggestive that firms are also becoming less profitable. So it's perhaps the possibility that there's a substitution between the environmental performance of these firms and their financial performance. Now, one question you'd want to ask, or at least we were interested in, is, are these results very specific to the influence of the Boardroom Accountability and the size of it? Or can we say something a little bit more broader? And so what we do is we, as an external validity test, we look at other environmental activist campaigns that were unrelated to the Boardroom Accountability Project. So other firms that were also targeted by activist investors, particularly for the reasons of improving their corporate environmental behaviors. And again, we find suggestive evidence that these results are not just focused directly to the Boardroom Accountability Project, but also seem to have some support within the external validity that these can bring about real important changes in corporate environmental behaviors as well. Now, this is 20 minutes only, so I think I won't be able to go through all our robustness tests, but we've thought about different approaches for propensity matching. We consider different sample restrictions to worry about if there's any biases within our data and how to think about that. We've tried different scaling measures, and we're really concerned, and we think about the importance of trying to appropriately address the inputs, and how do we think about the appropriate way of scaling our dependent variable. We have additional robustness tests as well, and test also other natural alternative hypotheses that have been proposed. And going through these, we find our results consistently go through, especially for our on-site emission reductions. And oh, sorry. What I wanted to focus on here, though, at the end is that socially responsible investing has been characterized by divestment campaigns. However, more recent research, and research is presented a part of this conference, has suggested that exit may be less effective than voice in pushing firms to act in a socially responsible manner. And so this paper focuses on investors that are focused primarily on the environmental behaviors of firms as a direct channel, and provides important suggestive empirical evidence saying that firms are responding by reducing their improving their corporate environmental behaviors and reducing their pollution. They these improvements are measurable in the local economies around the targeted plans. We show that these improvements are coming along changes from abatement initiatives, new capital expenditures related to these abatement initiatives, and seem not to be accompanied by changes in the levels or rate of production. And it seems also, though, that these improvements are also, though, coming at a cost in the performance of these firms as well, though. So at least our paper, I hope that I've convinced you that engagement may be an important tool when trying to address climate change risk and corporate environmental behaviors of firms.
Thank you.